Hey, everybody. On this episode of The Hopeful Has Been, we are tackling a really broad topic, and I'm going to try to condense it down into as short of amount of time as possible. If we can't get through it in one podcast, I'm going to pick a spot to kind of stop, and maybe we end up having to do an episode 2 on this topic. So, I've also, this is about my fifth or sixth take of trying to get this podcast started. And I think part of the reason that I am just stumbling over my words is I have a wheelbarrow full of notes here, and I just want to deliver the information as accurately as possible, but also blend in my experiences because my experience is different than some of the other professionals in the industry. And I think that that's one of the things that's important to talk about is your experience is valid. It may differ from what a veterinarian says or what another therapist says. And, I feel like we have to document our findings and then we have to stand on that documentation. And so, again, I may trip over my words a little bit more in this one because I have so much information to bring to you. So, our topic of the day is going to be back issues, back pain in the performance horse. Um, so, when I was asking people, what topic do you want to hear about? Everybody's like, oh, kissing spine, kissing spine. And that's such a hot topic and such a targeted word. Like now we have this whole industry that is starting to be centered around kissing spine horses. Whether it's, oh, this saddle's designed for kissing spine horses, this pad's designed for kissing spine horses, this supplement's designed for kissing spine horses. It just goes on and on and on and on and on. And so it's overwhelming for the average horse owner, but if it makes you feel any better, it's overwhelming for the average horse therapist too. Because my inbox is full of questions daily of people desperate to help their horses. And so sometimes that ends up like opening that door to buying things out of desperation, trying things out of desperation, where I hope that at the end of this, my goal is to provide you with some knowledge so that you can make the best possible choice for your horse. And to kind of give a little bit of our background in case you're new to following us, we used to have a rehab facility in Oklahoma where we specialized in EPM horses and kissing spine horses. That really wasn't my plan starting out. That's what we flowed into. And that's partly because we started educating. We started having these horses come in, and then we're like, oh, we're going to share the story of this horse. Also, like at the time that we started really addressing this in our rehab, it wasn't quite as popular as it is now. And I think, one of the things that has changed is now back x-rays are typically part of the average pre-purchase exam. I remember 10, 15 years ago, we talked about x-ray and stifles and hocks and hoof angles and things like that. But sometimes we didn't really think about the back. And now that just becomes standard procedure. And so you have a very opinionated group of people that are out there just, screaming from the mountaintops, you can't ride the radiographs. I don't care what the rads say. This horse is winning. All right, there's truth in that statement. Then on the flip side of that, you have the person that as soon as they see the radiographs where that spine is touching or even close, maybe not even touching yet, and they go, nope, had a bad experience with that. We'll never own another one. I won't touch that with a 10-foot pole and have a nice day. This is not the horse for me. And then you have people all in that middle ground. And so I think in order for us to talk about kissing spine, we have to first backtrack to, just discussing the difference between back pain and back problems, because there is a big difference there. And some of it is the roadmap that leads us to issues in the joint spacing later on down the road. And so, kind of also too, to talk about, like, to have a true starting point, let's humanize this a little bit and let's compare the difference between our spine versus our horse's spine. And so our horse is like a suspension bridge, so if you need an image, think the Golden Gate Bridge. We have this suspension system that keeps our bridge strong. And so when our horse engages their glutes and that core comes up and they accelerate, they are designed to move forward. And so our spine is more of a compression spine. So that means that our discs stack on top of one another. So in movement, when our glutes fire and our core engages and we move, we're going to actually move upward because that spine decompresses. So we're going to move upward before we can move forward. So if you want the image that I used to teach with during my courses, it's this. If I was standing and you came up behind me and poked me in the ribs and scared me, my body is going to spring me upward before I can move forward and run away. Our horse, on the other hand, if I come up behind a horse and clap and scare them, and they have a clear path, not tied to a trailer, not tied to a fence, if they're standing out in the open, and I come up behind and clap them, that horse, when their glutes engage and their core comes up, they're going to surge forward before they elevate. Now, and so, the other little silly part to my little demo that I do is, this is why when you are leading a horse and that horse is walking directly behind you and something spooks that horse, they end up running into your back because your spine sprung you up, their spine sprung them forward. And that's why we like our horses to walk at the side and not directly behind us, because then we get our feet run over and our horse hits us in the back. And so now you're going to be at a barrel race somewhere and you're going to see that happen. And now you're going to know the anatomy and why it happens. So anyway, there's two main differences in the structure of our spines there. And so, keep that little image or that little visual in the back of your mind. And so now we're going to carry this on through to kind of an orthopedic thought process. And so the most common issue that aside from trauma, car accidents and things like that, the most common orthopedic issue that takes people to the emergency room is back pain and knee pain. Those two things are very, very common. You can ask anybody that works in an emergency room that does orthopedic issues. And so, in my experience, two of the most common problems that we see that cause performance issues and dysfunction in our horses are stifle issues and back issues. And it's because those two things are so connected that if we start to have problems in one area, it's going to tend to eventually snowball into problems in the other area. And then we lose the whole functionality of the animal or the person, if we're talking about people. And so now let's move into, before we can hang our hat on a diagnosis, whether it be, bulging disc, a herniated disc, kissing spine, those are things that we have to go to a vet or we go to our doctor and we get that diagnosis. Now, in my opinion, a diagnosis is not always a nail in the coffin. Like, it doesn't necessarily mean this horse or person is useless or this horse or person will have to have surgery. We're going to get into that a little bit later on. But right now, I want to start just simply at the root of it, the difference in back pain versus back problems. And I'm going to reference a little bit on my notes here. I pulled a lot of information out of the Understanding the Horse's Back book. I'll post information on that in the bio on this podcast and in my videos. I'm not sure if that book is still in print or not, but I've been able to find it, and my students have been able to find it pretty easily online at used bookstores. So again, I'll add that information there, but I want to just throw out that I'm going to reference quite a bit out of that book because when I stumbled upon it, it was absolutely eye-opening for me. I went down this really long rabbit hole of we had a horse in the rehab that came in that was just super lethargic. Now, I knew the owner, I knew she was a great trainer. I knew her horse was not going to, when she had a problem with this horse, I knew she was not going to have an ill-mannered horse just based on what I knew about the person. And so how I got this referral, this is a referral that came from one of the bigger vet clinics that we worked with. And they called me, and it was a vet that I'd worked with quite a bit. And he said, Summer, he said, do you have a stall open? And of course, we usually always tried to kind of keep one stall that was not really on our schedule, that was for veterinary referrals. Because, when you're in the rehab business and a vet clinic calls you and says, hey, you have a stall open, you try really, really hard to have a stall open and continue that partnership with them. And so anyway, a vet that I'd worked with quite a bit called me and said, do you have a stall? And I said, yeah. I said, what do you got? And he said, I have a horse that has soft tissue injuries in both front legs that we cannot get to heal. And this horse would kind of fluctuate. There was some deep flexor issue. There was some suspensory issue. They had done Renovo in both sides, I believe more than once. So right out of the gate, they'd already spent quite a bit of money. And so they'd also had an MRI. They said, we're going to send the MRI to you. Here's this horse. Owner's bringing him over. All right, great. So then we start, and their problem was about the time they would kind of get some healing on one side of the front and the soft tissue in the front leg, the other one would start to have a problem. So I'm like, okay, soft tissue, this is in our wheelhouse. Well, so we get the horse in and I start working with this horse and we get, I don't know, maybe a week or so down the road. And maybe it wasn't even that long, maybe about a week. And I called the vet back and I said, hey, like this guy's like crippled in the stifle. Like, do y'all normally inject stifle on him? And the vet's like, oh, well, we've got MRI saying that the issue's in the front legs. I'm like, no, like I'm not disputing that. Like I get it. The MRI says it's there, it's there. But I'm like, have we considered that he's overloading the front end? Because like this stifle doesn't want to hold him. And I said, he doesn't lay down. I said, he doesn't rest, he doesn't lay down. And I said, for what I see right now in my body work and in my movement therapy is I have a stifle that is really sore and it is really problematic. And so end up talking to the owner. And I'm not sure if they had injected stifles on him or not. I can't remember and I don't want to misquote it. So anyway, we end up taking him to our attending vet and having him flex him up. Sure enough, sees the stifle, front end's kind of looking good at that point. And it's like, okay, we need to do something for the stifle. So we inject it and he really starts to improve in the front end because now he's able to load that hind end. And I'm like, all right, so we got a stifle issue. Like, all right, we can strengthen out of that. So we continue to strengthen on. And then he starts to kind of go downhill again on us. And my injections were pretty short-lived in that stifle. And so I had to take a piece of information back to my vet. Like, so I call my attending vet and I'm like, Dr. Crosby, like, I'm telling you, I do body work on this horse. And by the time I come out the next day, it's like I've never touched him again. I said, I cannot resolve the tension in the low back and the hamstrings. And I'm like, injecting the stifle helped it a little bit. And I said, can we look at the angle of the hind feet? So we look at the angle of the hind feet on him. And then we have some NPA going on. Like, okay, we can work with that as well. Well, then we started to look, I had found in a book, and I will reference this book as well, What Horses Have Told Me. And it's written by a French osteopath. I'll reference that one as well. I had found a passage in this book where he talked about, horses that have too long of a toe, and we have negative plantar angles. So plantar is our hind feet, palmar is our front feet. If you need an easy way to remember that, how I remembered it in massage school is palms of our hands. So there's our front feet, and we plant with our feet. So there's my how I remember my forehand to my hind feet. So anyway, we have this MPA going on. So I had found a passage in that book where he talks about, changing the angle of that stifle and the tension that is caused on that stifle by having the lowered foot angles, and how it radiates all the way up and just, kind of wrecks the suspension bridge of our spine. And so if we go back to our visual of the Golden Gate Bridge, what happens if we have our pillars on either end of the bridge, and then one of our pillars starts to sink? Well, then our bridge is going to slowly be starting to be pulled back towards our pillar that is sinking. And so when we translate that over to the spine, when those heels start to lower, it starts to pull back on the pelvis starts to flatten, starts to tip forward, everything starts to shorten. And so based on that, I was like, oh, maybe I need to x-ray this horse's back. Now, this horse did not have really any back pain. There was muscle tension there, but he was not a horse that really palpated sore because he was lethargic and stoic, which we're going to get into personality types a little farther in this podcast. So sure enough, we go back to Dr. Crosby. I call the owner and I said, I'm going to be honest with you. I said, I don't have anything backing this. I said, other than I'm working on a hunch. I said, but I was up at 3 a.m. crying over your horse because he's been here for 60 days at this point. I said, I don't even know if I'm wasting your money. I don't know if I'm helping you, but I can't resolve this with body work. And, we need to correct the angles of these feet. But I think we need to look at his back. So we go over there, shoot x-rays. Sure enough, we have multiple vertebrae that are touching. And so, that was when I started to really put the pattern together of, oh, I have to start correcting things in the feet, so that I can start to make corrections in the back. Now, we're going to get into a little bit of that later on. That was just my first real experience with having to work as a therapist to help the vets, because I don't know how much money we would have ended up spending injecting and working on those horses' legs and not even searching for something up in the back. And so, other things that were in that book of Jeannot's was he talked about horses that, park back on a feeder, sit back in the corner of a stall, lean back on things, or the horse that smashes their shavings up and makes a little ramp and then stands on it because they can elevate their heels. And so there were several personality things in there that fit this horse because, again, he was not a reactive type of horse. And I know at one point I even had the owner run blood work on him because I was like, okay, I said, I understand he's a very well broke horse. Like, I get you. I hear you. Thank you for sending me a horse that is well trained. But I'm like, there is a difference in a well broke horse that still has some spark to their eye, and a horse that is just lethargic, that just stands there with their head hung and kind of almost doesn't have that will to go on, the will to live. And I said, he at times fluctuates over into that, like, okay, buddy, you're lethargic. Like, you can't quit on us. Like, I'm not quitting on you, so you can't quit on me. And so, I'll circle back into a little more of this horse's story later on. But I want to come back to my topic of back pain versus back problems. So when we're talking about back pain, we're talking about nerve pain. So our nerve endings register the chemical changes that are going on in the tissues when there's damage to the area. So thinking of like atrophy, saddle fit, that's when we're actually having pain. But nerves can also have different phenomenon that happens as well. So when I would work with my human clients, I could get a lot of feedback from them where they would come in and they would say, common things that I would hear would be, I have this just dull pain that's always there. It's dull, it's persistent, it's a throbbing pain. It feels like an ice pick. It's the worst pain that I've ever been in. It feels like electricity, like something is shocking me and it's radiating down my leg. I've heard people describe it as it feels like there's water under their skin or static. When I was before having my hips replaced, I would talk a lot about femoral nerve pain, and mine always felt electric, like static. I've also had people that have described waking up in the middle of the night because they think they have bugs crawling on them in bed. And what it ends up being, it's nerve pain. There's nothing there. They get up and pull the sheets off, but there's nothing there. When my dad was having really bad back pain, he had a spot that on his IT band on the outside of his thigh, that he would sit there when he was watching TV and he would absent-mindedly just scratch the spot, and had actually like made a sore there because he would just sit and scratch it. And my mom would holler at him and go, "Alan, quit scratching your leg." But he was doing it subconsciously, didn't even realize that he was doing it. So there was a little bit of a flicker of nerve pain or nerve issue there, that was causing that itching. And so, we see those, we would assume that our horses are going to have that same phenomena, so when we think of nerve pain or back pain, a lot of times it's the stabbing, shooting, reactive pain is what brings us to the emergency room, or what leads that horse into acting out, or acting out of character, which in turn makes us think, oh, we better go to the vet and figure out what's going on here. But when we're comparing that to back problems don't always have pain that correlates with it. Back problems are the result of incorrect use of the back over time. So when we think about the horse that's traveling elevated and their back is hollowed out, a horse that isn't fit enough to be doing what we're asking them to do, a horse that doesn't have enough top line, that's under muscled, or a horse that is overweight or obese, and we're asking them to do something like go rope a pen of 10 steers, hoof angles. These are things that will lead to bigger problems down the road. So here is where that misconception of you can't ride the radiographs, meaning our x-rays tell us what's going on at this moment in time, but x-rays don't always give us a picture of how, or a way to assess how much pain that individual's in. But here's the thing about it. If you may not be able to ride your radiographs today, but if you don't have that baseline and you don't start making lifestyle changes to correct problems found in radiographs, it will probably come back and rear its head later on. And then you're going to have a whole lot of compensation patterns. You're going to have a whole lot of things to have to work through. And so later on this podcast, we're going to pro and con surgery, and what we can do if we don't want to do surgery. When is surgery an option? When is it not? But for what we're comparing now is pain versus problems. When we have a chain reaction of compensation patterns over time, that will eventually lead to pain. So, when people ask me my opinion, I say, well, you can't ride the radiographs until you have to. And so I like having a baseline. I am that person. And sometimes I'm not good about having a baseline. I'll use my own mare as an example that we just did the OCD surgery on. Had I bought her, I probably would have done a pre-purchase, and we probably would have caught that OCD on that Stifle many, many moons ago. But I raised her, and mechanically, she was always pretty correct. So I didn't have a reason to investigate any further. Now, knowing what I know as a therapist, and I'm trying to save y'all money too. I'm trying to save y'all money, time, and heartbreak. Um, I would do a set of, just looking at that horse. I want to know what's underneath there. But that was something that I also would advise to my human clients. I would say, like, hey, you've been in here, we've been working on back stuff for months here. And if your insurance deductible's met, go have that MRI done. Even if you are the person that goes, I will never have surgery. Okay, go have your MRI done. Let's look at it. Let's take that information and put it up, because in 5 years, we might need to revisit that information and go, oh, we started out with some mild changes, and now we are moderate to maybe severe in our changes in the spine. And so we really have to start thinking about it. But at least we have a baseline. And so, do I feel like every horse is going to have a back issue? No, I don't. I know people. I'm a great example of that, as a matter of fact. They spotted on an x-ray on me, a lower back x-ray, the slight start of degeneration in my disc when I was 16 years old. Now, since having my hips corrected and having my hips replaced, it is very rare that I have any sort of a back issue. And a lot of times, if I am having any sort of back issues, it's coming from my psoas in the front. And we're going to touch on that, how that correlates to a horse later on as well. But I enjoy having that baseline there, because back surgeries, neck surgeries, that is stuff that runs in my family. Degenerative disc disease is on both sides of my family pretty prominently. And so it gave me that, hey, you have to control the aspects of your life. That tells me that, the possibility is there. And so I probably don't want to be a person that sits at a desk and doesn't have a lot of movement. I've been doing a lot of computer work lately, and I'm telling you, I am feeling the lack of core strength, because I've spent so much screen time doing these podcasts and things lately. And I'm so ready to get back out on the road and start teaching again, where I'm moving every single day and not stuck here and trying to do paperwork. But, sometimes it's life and we got to play catch up. And that's where I'm at right now in this point of my life. So having that baseline, having that MRI keeps me accountable for knowing I'm somebody who has to stay in the gym. I'm somebody who needs to watch my weight. I'm somebody who needs to watch my general strength. And that is going to carry me through, hopefully not having that back start to get worse as I age. And so, coming back to our horses and how that relates to them, one of the most common questions that I got asked when I was asking for, what do you want me to cover in this podcast? Multiple people asked me to address them seeking a genetic component to kissing spine. And that's something personally I don't have enough research on to have an educated enough opinion. So that's not a topic I'm going to touch in this podcast, but I'm going to leave you with my perspective on it. Okay, say we do find a genetic component there. We know that there's a genetic component to degenerative disc disease in people, but it doesn't mean I'm going to come down with it. It's not like it's a sickness I'm going to contract because of my family. It's not like, oh, this is a death sentence. You are definitely going to have back problems because everybody in your family does. For me, genetic markers, I have so much of a love for Eastern medicine and traditional Chinese medicine, that there are so many studies of the body being able to heal itself from things that Western medicine has already tacked a label on. And so I don't like to back myself into a corner of, just because something is genetically predisposed, means you're going to have it and you just got to learn to deal with it. So, my thought process on that is I'm going to look at the horse as an individual, and we're going to see where are the weak areas. So that leads us into the topic of, is it poor conformation or is it poor posture? When we talk about like horses, when we talk about poor posture, that could be everything from the horse that is not at a fitness level to do what we are asking them to do, meaning they don't have enough stabilizing muscle or postural muscle to have correct carriage. Or that could mean that our training aids are forcing this horse into a posture that is not natural and it's not beneficial to that individual. When we are forcing the head down and we force that body into compliance with our training gadgets, the first thing that causes is restriction in the neck vertebrae. And so if we've got restriction there, that horse is not able to balance. So our horses use their neck and head to help balance and make up for weakness in that hind end. So if we have a horse that does not have enough muscling through their glutes, like if they're lacking, I see a lot of horses that biceps femoris is really poorly underdeveloped. It's like you have maybe even you have an overbuilt glute, and then it's like the rest of the rear just falls off, and everything is atrophied and underdeveloped there. What you end up having with those horses, a lot of times they want to travel with their head higher, and that back hollowed out because they're trying to balance. You also have the balancing from left to right. And so they're counterbalancing for the weak diagonal. And whenever we have that, and then we trap that head down and we force them into a posture that is unrealistic or fits into the module that we want for a certain event, we caught that restriction in the neck causes the same wear and tear on the joints that we see on the joints in the feet. Neck pain also affects the balance and the function of the back. So if the neck is locked up, the back is not going to have the natural movement that we need it to. And so, that gets into are we over bridling these horses? Are we trying to create a balance point, but that balance point is actually just binding the neck up? And that's probably a whole nother topic. It's like, it's very hard because you have multiple events out there that require movements that are not natural to the horse. I mean, barrel racing being one of them. And I'm one of those people, like, I'm a competitor at heart. I love competing. I always have goals of trying to make it back to the competition arena, but I want to try to keep my horse in as natural of posture as I possibly can. But I also don't want to be the person that's attacking people on the internet. Like we've got to find that middle ground. There's a page that I really respect that has some great things that I agree with, but the entire stretch of the Olympics going on, that page used their platform, and they have a big platform, a much bigger one than I do, to just attack these Olympians. And I'm like, okay, we have to advocate for our horses, but at the same time, when we come at it from an aspect of attacking other people, are we really benefiting the industry? And then, my perspective, my thought goes to, okay, so many of these Olympic horses are older. They're not taking the 4-year-olds over there. These are older aged, seasoned horses. And sometimes you get to a point where some of those compensation patterns have been there so long that they get really, really hard to correct. And you have to go, ooh, do we keep that horse in motion and in performance and in movement? Because if we retire that horse, are they going to be so eat up with arthritis that it shortens their lifespan? So again, I think there has to be a happy medium. We can't have a war on our trainers and our competitors in these events, but we also have to stand up and advocate for our horse. And so, then the second part of this topic is poor conformation. When we look at how breeding has changed over the years, um, it is easy to start to categorize. That was one thing. I'm a little bit of a pedigree guru myself, and so every time horses would come in, especially if they're barrel horses. Now, I don't know a lot about bloodlines and things like that, and the warm bloods and other breeds. So we did have those in our rehab, but most of the horses that came in were performance horses because that's what my background is. And so when we talk about how conformation has changed, if somebody was asking my opinion on, looking at horses, whether you're breeding your own horse or whether you're looking at a prospect, the first thing I'm going to look at is how low heeled is that horse? How developed or underdeveloped is that hip area on the horse? Like, how much balance do we have there? Because a lot of our running bred horses are big shouldered, they elevate more in the front, the backs have gotten longer, and then we have a problematic underdeveloped hip. And so what that ends up causing is a horse that wants to pull with their front end in motion and elevate, and they're doing all of their motion with the front end, versus a horse that can load that hindquarters and drive up underneath. And so, why is that important? Well, it goes back to being able, is the back hollowed out or is the back rounded? So when we have a nice rounded back, that allows the hind legs to come up underneath the body farther, and it creates momentum and forward motion without overloading the front legs. So when we, our front end is designed to be able to take on more weight than the hind end for sure. But we don't want the horse trying to do every bit of the motion with the front legs, and then the back legs are just kind of following along here, because what ends up happening is that concussion causes bony changes in the front feet. We open the door for soft tissue injuries and, chronic issues over time, knee pain, just all kinds of things, including a horse that's what we call body lame. So when we have a horse that we categorize as body lameness, that means this horse just doesn't move right. He's not blockable lame anywhere. We don't have a visible issue with an ankle, issue with a foot, issue with a knee, but it's like, this sucker just doesn't move good. He feels like crap. He looks like crap. There's nothing fluid about him, and he just doesn't look good. And usually that also accompanies a lot of restriction and tension in the fascia. So you might have a horse that looks what I call deflated, where it looks like you poked him with a pin and just let the air out, where that skin and that fascia is just tightening up and just wrapping itself, like if we saran wrapped him and deflated that horse. So, that's what, as body workers, we call that a body lame horse. And so, if a horse is unable to round their back, that adds concussion throughout the body and is more likely to develop joint degeneration in the hind limbs or the front feet. So when we talk about problems in our hocks, problems in our stifles, problems in whorl bones, problems in all the joints of the front leg, most of the time, those problems can be reduced and prevented by having a horse that is able to move in correct posture. And so even if we have the horse that maybe doesn't have the ideal conformation of, like, okay, we're a little long back here, this one kind of ties in a little bit high, they kind of want to elevate a little bit in the front. Okay, we can work with that. We don't take a person that is less than the ideal and just go, well, we're just going to throw you away because you got some weak areas here. That's never our intention as therapists, but we have to address those weak areas and start to strengthen them. So, this is where our workouts are very different. A football player is going to have, in their body type, is going to have a very different type of workout than a basketball player that has a lot longer, leaner muscles. The longer, leaner muscles typically is going to also result in some weaker joints as well. And so those people and horses have to work more on strengthening because they may be a little hypermobile. They may be a little over flexible, where a person or a horse that has a lot bigger body mass, a lot wider, stouter body mass, is typically going to have more trouble with flexibility and is going to be stronger just in nature because they're going to be more balanced. And so, this is where our cross training comes in, again, whether we're talking about horses or people, and knowing what is best for that individual, which, brings me to one of those hot takes that you see on social media where everybody's like, this is the workout for barrel horses. This is what you need to do for your barrel horse. Well, okay, I can't tell you what you need to do for your barrel horse without seeing your barrel horse, because I need to know what he looks like. I need to know what type of body that you have there. And then I can figure out an exercise routine that's going to not cause excess concussion on the body and is going to work on improving weak areas. And so, another thing, that little tip that you can file away, our horses, the way that they land has more to do with their posture and the rounding of the back. Whereas people, interesting fact that I read in the Understanding the Back book that I had never really thought about, with people, our consciousness is much more different than our horse. We have a different consciousness, a different ability with how our brains are. So sometimes our posture is more related to our mental state than it is our physical state. Now, not to say that just because I tell myself every day that I look in the mirror that I'm going to be an athlete, that I could go and run a 5K tomorrow, because my physical state would go, we can't do this. But when we deal with depression, when we deal with anxiety, all of our mental health issues correlate directly to our organs. Now, they do in horses as well. But in my experience, I find that when horses are in a good environment where their needs are met, where their movement needs, their nutritional needs, their socialization needs, when those basic survival needs are met, they tend to shed off those past traumatic situations. They tend to forgive very quickly. They tend to not hold on to things like people. We are definitely the species that tends to like to pack our baggage around with us and not let that go. And so they've actually proven how much of our downward force, when we talk about, the old saying, you got the weight of the world on your shoulders, it actually has been proven that it does affect our posture. When you are under stress, when you are exhausted, when you are depressed, anxious, we actually have more downward force, and it's reflected in the way that we ride our horses. And so when you talk about somebody that is heavy in the stirrups or heavy in the irons, they will say, that doesn't necessarily have to do with the weight of the rider. Sometimes it has to do with the mental state of the rider, because when our mind is clouded, all of our body just doesn't function like it should. And so, there's something to add in there as well. When we talk about problems of the horse, and especially when we get farther into um, symptoms and things like that, sometimes we have to stop and address, are we causing this as a rider? Are we unbalancing our horse? And that's a whole nother podcast topic on talking about rider health and things like that. But it's something to take note of. We want to create a balanced horse, but we also have to create a balanced rider to the best of our ability. And so moving on kind of to our next topics here, I want to get into a little bit of symptoms and things that we see. And I guess before I get into symptoms, I want to talk about the visual aspects that we see with a horse that's exhibiting back pain or back issues. To shorten the verbiage here, we're going to just simply talk about back issues, whether it be pain, whether it be a problem, whether it be a condition that we have a diagnosis for. How often do you look at your horse's skin? We usually, when we are thinking about skin and hair coat and the quality of those two things, most times our mind goes to nutrition. Is our nutritional needs met? Or social media goes, just throw some alfalfa at it. That fixes everything. Well, not always. Nutrition's one part, because as we've talked about, we have our spinal nerves that come out of our spine area. We have our central nervous system that's given feedback to the brain. But our skin is a great reflection of telling us what's going on, yes, nutritionally in the body, but also with the muscle system in the body. Our musculoskeletal system is hugely reflected by what we can see in the skin and the hair. When we talk about ill-fitting tack, everybody is familiar with seeing a saddle sore, where we have that white hair that comes back. Sometimes the hair doesn't come back at all. I've seen horses that have these like round callus spots by their withers, or that's a common spot for them, and the hair doesn't even grow back. But when we do have that white hair come in, most people don't even realize what causes it. What is going on in the body in that aspect when you have something that is compressing and constantly rubbing in an area, that signals to the body and our nerves and our fascia, hey, we have a problem here. We need to come in and thicken this area, because if what is happening, if that wears through that area, then we get into the internal issue, the internal structures, and the body's always trying to protect itself. So that feedback gets sent up that central nervous system to the brain and says, hey, we need to thicken the skin here. We need to thicken this area. And so that's what happens. The body sends more support there. The cells start to thicken, but as we're thickening that area, because again, pressure sore doesn't happen overnight, that's usually going to be a repeated issue to an area. And then as that thickens, then we don't get good feedback. There's not enough nutrients getting to that area. And so when we don't have enough nutrients coming back to that hair follicle, it doesn't create the pigment. So therefore, we have white areas that come back. Now, as in my experience as a body worker, a lot of times we can go in there and break those areas up. And I have actually seen in cases that white hair to shed out and it come back in color. It come back the color that it should be. When we are working with rehabbing kissing spine horses, and I'm going to get into a little bit of this later on in the rehab topics, one of my biggest pet peeves is when vets just tell owners, oh, just turn out this horse after kissing spine surgery and bring him back up in 90 days and then start conditioning him. I can tell you from experience, horses that just get kicked out and have no scar release done will have restriction and scar tissue in that back and in the dorsal line of fascia that comes along the top of the horse that is extremely hard to break down after it has been there for an extended amount of time. You know, I want to be able to start doing light body work techniques on these horses as they are healing, because I want to be able to get as much oxygen, as much nutrients, as much good blood flow back to those areas. And if I do my job right, you will not be able to see or detect a scar over the spine of that horse. I am very frustrated as in my personal goals as a therapist if I cannot break that scar tissue down over the back, because I want there to be as much glide and function of that area as possible. Now, sometimes, you know, I got to set realistic goals. If I get the horse that, you know, had kissing spine surgery 2 years ago, and I'm just now getting to start working on them, it may be almost impossible to get that to break down completely. Now, I should be able to improve it, but maybe not get it to break down completely. Same way with old saddle marks. You know, if that saddle mark has been there for 5 or 6 or 10 years, chances are I'm not going to get that hair to come back in the color that it should be. Like, I'm probably not going to get rid of all the white hair there. But if I start on those areas quick enough, in most cases, I can get that white hair to shed out and the actual color of hair to come back in. And so, you know, focal points like pressure sores, those are easy to figure out. But also, like, one thing I want you to expand your thought process on is a dull coat equals muscle tension and the lack of blood flow. You know, so many times we attribute a dull coat to nutritional needs not being met. And yes, there is truth in that as well. But when we have a horse that is on a high quality diet and that coat is still dull, that means there is lack of circulation delivering fresh quality blood and oxygen throughout that body. And so there's where the dull coat comes in. My mare that just had the OCD surgery, one of the things that she does when her stifles really bother her, and I can't stop her from doing it, is she will rub out a section of mane right in the middle of her neck. And she just gets so itchy there. It's not something that can be corrected topically. It's not something I can correct with a shampoo. It's not a fungus. It's not, it is literally when she has to balance with her neck, one of the things that she likes to do is she's just constantly wanting to rub it. And so, of course, naturally, we're post OCD surgery, and I have hung brushes for her to itch on. We have hung, you know, rubber things for her to itch on. And she has, as she has been sore throughout this process, about rubbed out that whole chunk of mane again. And so it will be interesting to see, and you can also notice the muscles below that, you know, so the focal point is the fact that she is missing a chunk of mane, and that's a huge eyesore because we like a horse that has a balanced mane, right? But when you look below that into the muscle structure, you see that she gets really overbuilt on either side, and I have to really work on our muscles there, you know, through my rhomboids and that type of area to keep that balance and to keep that compensation pattern from leading to a dip or a scoop in the neck. You know, and if we have issues in the stifle, we're going to also have that. That's going to also be paired with issues in the back as well. And so, you know, that's one thing I would encourage you, step back and look at. If that horse's coat is dull and you know you're feeding a quality diet, then we need to look at what's going on in the muscle. It is not uncommon for horses after a bodywork session to shine like you put show sheen on them. And it's simply because we're getting fresh oxygen moving through that body and better blood flow. We're opening up the floodgates, if you will, and bringing and restoring blood flow to areas that have been restricted probably for a long time. Another thing I'm going to touch on is the feet. So if the feet are uncomfortable for any reason, this causes the back to tighten, especially in the loin or our lumbar area. So that's the body's way of trying to relieve concussion. Ooh, my feet hurt, so I'm going to tense my back and try to shorten my stride, and hopefully that causes less concussion on my feet, which actually really doesn't work that way. It's a compensation pattern, but shortening that stride actually causes more concussion on the front feet. And so it's a two-part thing. You know, that statement is not meant to be like, okay, everybody gets mad at their farrier. It's bringing awareness to how important the connection is between keeping the feet comfortable and back pain. So I'm going to cross this over to a human example that you can probably relate to. So when my human clients would come in with back pain, 9 times out of 10, they would come in wearing flip-flops. And I would have to have this discussion with them of, okay, I understand when your back hurts, the last thing you want to do is bend over and have to tie your shoes, but continuing to wear these flip-flops is making you have a heel strike pattern, making you take more force on the heel, and that is radiating up and causing your back pain to stay and or to worsen. And then sometimes when you deal with people, you have this push and pull dialogue that comes back and forth, where about the third or fourth time that person comes in to get work done, I'm like, and you're still wearing these flip-flops. Like, my empathy meter is starting to go down. Like, I am trying to tell you, you have to spend money on good quality shoes if you want to eliminate your back pain or improve your back pain. And also too, I'd have to have with my men, it was usually the conversation of, you have come in with the boots that have been resold 5 times. And if you are that attached to this particular set of boots, have somebody make a flower holder out of them and put them on your kitchen table if you need to continue to keep this set of boots because you are attached to it, because they are killing your back. And so things that we see with people is, I'm going to give you this little old cowboy type of image in your mind, where they're bow-legged, they're breaking out over the sides of their boots. That's a good indicator of back issues and hip issues. So we see the same thing in horses. When a horse has flares on the hind feet, or I call it, looks like a spade foot, where it's like, if that horse is barefoot, they're blowing out the sidewalls of their hind feet, where it gives their little foot almost kind of like a triangle look to it. When we have flares, that indicates a pathology higher than the hock. So we're talking about an issue in the stifle, an issue in the SI, an issue in the back. And so, same thing as our little old cowboy visual that we have here. But I've also seen people, I promise you, look, the next time you go in the Walmart, you'll see them. People that are blowing out over the side of their flip-flops, and maybe the heel of their foot or the side of their foot is hanging off that flip-flop, touching the really gross Walmart floor. That's the same compensation pattern that we see in our horses when we have those sidewalls that are blown out. And so, how we start to remedy that is, one, figuring out what our root cause is, addressing it, and then starting into corrective exercise and things like that. The last thing I want to touch on before we get in more into some specific symptoms for back pain is proprioception. When we have a blockage or a restriction anywhere along that central nervous system that is trying to give feedback to the brain, our proprioception is going to be affected. And so, in the simplest terms, what is proprioception? It is our awareness of where we are in space and time. So if I go to sit down on a chair and I don't pay attention to where, when I'm backing up to the chair, like, so if I back up to this recliner, but I'm over here where this recliner ends, and I go to sit down, my proprioceptive nervous system is going to alert my brain, hey, there's nothing underneath you. You're going to fall. Stop. And you go, oh, I got to look down and I am not square with the chair. Moves over square, sits down. That is what our proprioceptive system does. You know, the easiest way to, in people, to know, the easiest way to explain when our proprioceptive system is severely affected would be the effects of alcohol. You know, everybody has seen the person that has drunk too much and it like almost falls off of a curb, but is able to like somehow stay standing, and they're just stumbling on along their way. That is our proprioceptive system struggling to keep up with the fact that we are mentally clouded because we've had too much to drink. You know, other things in horses that we see affect proprioception, obviously, neurologic issues, neck issues, EPM, Lyme, you know, there's all kinds of things like that. But today we're going to focus on talking about it coming from tension or restriction in the back. So when we have what we call a delayed signal, when the horse is trying to figure out where to position their hind leg, and there's a lag in the system because of restriction, it takes too long for that nerve impulse to get to the brain, where our brain goes, okay, this is the correction that needs to be made, and then sends that all the way back down the nerve. That's where we end up having horses that don't know where to put their feet, or that have twist of the legs whenever they move or walk. You know, we're just not getting feedback back and forth from the brain to the hind end of that horse. And so, you know, the disconnect could be in the neck, the disconnect could be in the thoracics, the disconnect could be in the lumbar, the disconnect could be in the sacrum. You know, there's a lot of areas in between there that could lead to issues in that disconnect. And so one of the things that was interesting to me that I learned from a surgeon that we got a lot of referrals from is we ended up having a dialogue where I was asking him, I said, why is it that before we find kissing spine in these horses, you know, they end up being the horse that's been treated 2 or 3 or 10 times for EPM? And in his perspective and his experience is, he said, I feel like something in the EPM medications treats the fascia. He said, I think that there is some of the components in some of these EPM treatments that help that back to relax. And for me, it was a light bulb moment, because when I went back to joint pain for autoimmune conditions in people, one of the things that they use to treat joint pain is doxycycline, which, you know, we know is an antibiotic. But in small doses, tiny doses, I've had clients that have conditions like rheumatoid arthritis, or that have lupus that causes terrible joint pain, or that have fibromyalgia. All of these immune issues that have a big reflection in the fascia. You can have somebody that has lived for years on an extremely low dose of doxycycline. Now, you can't do it on a high dose, because it is also known to cause sun sensitivity, and is really hard on the stomach in high doses. So, but it was a light bulb moment for me of like, okay, that is what the doxy is doing. This is what we call off-label uses, you know, where that's not what this medication is designed for, but it darn sure helps with it. So it gets prescribed for that. And so, you know, again, it made me start thinking about the proprioceptive system, the fascia, and why these back horses improve with EPM treatment. Now, not to say that it's a false diagnosis and there's not any EPM there, because I don't think that that's a true statement either. because going back to our disruptions in the vertebrae, when we have back pain, all of our organs slow down, remember? So that opens up the possibility for leaky gut and all of the things that do cause true EPM. But that being said, that was a pivotal moment talking to that vet where I'm like, okay, some of these EPM medications are treating more than just the EPM possibly. And so there again, it comes down to that getting to that root cause, because that's just a common thing that we would see where you'd have this horse that, like I said, it's been treated 3, 4, 12 times for EPM. And we go, man, he's pretty low heeled in the back. Like, have you x-rayed the hind feet? Have you x-rayed the back? And they go, no. Well, we go x-ray and that horse is close or touching. I help out on online forums all the time where people are asking, for advice. And sometimes I feel like I sound like a broken record on there because I go, have you x-rayed the hind feet? And have you x-rayed the back? Again, because I just want to get that baseline. So now I'm going to break into some signs of back problems. And this is going to be more back problems without pain. Because when we have the horse that you go up there and you palpate down the back and they fall to the ground, okay, that's kind of a no-brainer. Let's go look at their back. When we have the horse that has bucked the rider off 5 or 6 times, we can't find a saddle that fits, that's kind of a no-brainer. Let's go look at the back. So these are going to be a little more in-depth type of things, aside from the obvious horse that bucks, the obvious horse that's in pain. Because the sad realization that I have come to is the horse that is in pain that is reactive will usually find their way to the vet quicker than the horse that is lethargic and stoic. And I guess let me touch on that a little bit before we get into symptoms. So the analogy that I like to use to teach with, I kind of humanize it a little bit. So when we're talking about the difference between stoic and reactive, I use a little person analogy. So everybody knows, and maybe you have worked with, the stoic person that has had back pain for a long time. They go, okay, I'm going to work. I am a good employee. I have not missed a day of work in 30 years. I'm going to show up and I'm going to do exactly what my job description is. Don't ask me to do anything more. Don't ask me to do anything extracurricular. When I clock out, I'm going to go home. I'm going to do my necessary duties at home, and then I'm going to sit in a recliner, drink a beer, watch TV, and I'm not moving from this recliner until I have to get up to go to work tomorrow. And I'm going to do the same thing over and over and over again until the end of time. A lot of times when I think about this in horses, I think about the super stoic lesson horse that you really never know whether they're in pain or not, because they make the same trip every time. I think about the mechanical rope horse, where maybe he even has a little bit of a limp and a head bob, but he makes the same run every time, no matter how many steers you rope. In barrel horses, I think about the horse that just has no light in their eyes, where it's like, I'm just going through the motions because this is what is expected of me. That is the stoic horse. And a lot of times I feel like that gets misinterpreted as the horse that's good and broke and safe and consistent, because they may absolutely be all of those things. My mare is an extremely broke horse. I can ride her with a neck rope. I can do a lot of great things with her. But when you look at her, she still has a fire in her eye and a flare and a little bit of arrogance when she feels good. When she doesn't feel well, her eye flattens a little bit. She's not one that really gets the triangled worry type of eye very much. She's stoic and she just gets flat and goes, I'm going to do this thing because it's expected of me. but I'm not going to do it well, and I'm really not enjoying doing it. I don't have that spring in my step. I don't have that eagerness to perform. I'm just going to do it because you asked me to. And so then on the flip side of that, we have the reactive or the hysterical person. And I'm sure all of y'all have encountered this person too. Usually this is more of, when you're stoic, the body is shutting down. And so we think of those horses that maybe have more problems with impaction colic, problems with a reduced digestion, problems with circulation. They just get cold, they're arthritic. Now, on the flip side, when we're talking about reactiveness, that gets into the hysterical person, where it's like, oh my gosh, I can't believe they asked me to do one more thing at work. Like, do they not understand that my back hurts? Why don't they understand that my back hurts? And, I just can't believe that they would ask me for something, and blah, 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 blah. And they're just dialed to the tens all the time. And you want to look at them and go, stop and take a breath. Come down and take a breath. But the problem is, most times they don't have the ability to come down and take a breath because their fascia is so tight. They have been stuck in flight for so long that every little thing sets them off. Everything makes them irritated. Everything makes them mad. And they're not afraid to tell you when they're upset or mad, or they internalize it and blow up and explode later. So now when we take that over into our horses, that's the horse that turns the first barrel and boom, breaks in two and bucks. That's the horse that you go to throw the saddle on and they boom and set back off the back of the trailer. That's the horse that you go to brushing them and you hit one spot that is sore and they turn around and snap and bite at you. These are reactive responses to problems in the body. Also going back to that, could you just come down and take a deep breath? A lot of times the reason you don't have the ability is because our psoas is so intertwined and connected with our diaphragm that when that psoas is on and stuck in flight, it pulls on that diaphragm where we don't have the expansion of our lungs, whether it be a horse, whether it be a person. And so when we think about these reactive types, the types that come to mind, of course, EPM is a big thing that comes to my mind there, because we know how reactive those horses could be. But, ulcers, foregut ulcers, hindgut ulcers, too much acid production. Again, the horse that sets back, that it gets unsafe to be around. Tying up, because we have that energy that is building in the body and there's nowhere for it to go, because that horse is just working through. Horses, unless we have a diet or a genetic component, which is another podcast topic. But, when we have a horse that ties up, it is after extreme exertion, and the body can't cycle that lactic acid out of the muscles like it needs to. So that's what leads to our tying up. So I think a little more about like heat type of issues, swelling on the stifles, fluid on the hocks, fluid on the knees, stuff that is hot to the touch. And again, that restriction in fascia. And so, of course, then you can obviously have a horse or a person that falls in the middle of these two categories, where they are stoic for a little while of like, okay, my back really hurts, but I'm going to continue to do this. Like, I'm going to do the thing. I'm going to do the thing. I'm going to do the thing. Well, then they've internalized it to a point that you have an atomic bomb level of explosion. And you could ask any of the girls that worked for me when my hips were bothering me so bad when we had the rehab. Any of the girls could tell you that there were days that I had to work really hard to control my emotions in the barn, where I would start my morning off of, okay, girls, my hips are really hurting me. My nerve pain is really, really bad today. Nobody's in trouble. I'm not mad at anybody, but I want to get through the day. Like, let's not horse around. Let's not joke around today. Let's get through our day of work because I am really just wanting to go back up and lay back down or sit in the recliner. And, that's the difference in consciousness of being a person, where I understand that I may be a little bit quick on the trigger today. I may be easily agitated today, and I could come in and explain to my staff, hey, I am dying. Like, my pain level is a 47 on a level to 10, and nobody's in trouble. And I'm going to try to keep this internalized long enough to do a good job at work today. Where our horses, those type of horses tend to get ignored until they snap. And so if we can start to recognize some of these symptoms and some of these signs before we get to that explosiveness, then hopefully we can have better horses that are happier with their jobs, and we don't get somebody hurt. Because I mean, that's the thing. Like, I don't want to see somebody get hurt by a horse that is forced to act out of character because they have endured pain longer than they are capable of. So here's a few common signs, and I've got about 4 pages of notes here. Some of these I'm going to elaborate on. Some of them I'm just going to roll through them, and you can take notes if you want. If you've got questions on them, you can always reach out and ask more. So these are going to be movement issues. And again, I'm going to address stuff without pain because pain is the obvious one. So I don't feel like we got to spend a whole lot of time on that. If there's a lot of back pain, investigate that. Plain simple. Okay, these are going to be movement issues. When we have a horse that drifts in a turn, so that means that horse is disengaging the hindquarters. And so what ends up happening there mechanically, like what we're looking at mechanically when we have that horse that drifts, is a horse that is unable to load the outside diagonal because the inside hind leg has drifted across and impeded the movement. Because we can't take a leg through a leg, right? So then we have to take a step to the outside, which disengages that hindquarters. So most commonly, my customers complain about a horse that drifts in the turn or has no power in their turns. That means we have a weakness in the hind end that could be caused from an issue in the back, could be caused from an issue in the stifle, but one of those things is usually going to snowball into the other. A horse that feels unbalanced at a lope, trouble catching their leads. A lot of times we think SI issues, but when we're injecting the SI, really what we're doing is we are putting our steroid or our Renovo, our injection into an open spaced area that talks with the central nervous system through the fascia, because there's not an actual, joint there that we are sticking a needle through. We are sticking a needle in an area and dispensing whatever medication our vet is putting in there, knowing that it's going to get into that big sheet of gluteal fascia, knowing that it's going to get through all of our fascial connections and getting rid of that inflammation, getting rid of pain, talking to that central nervous system saying, hey, come down out of flight. So, an SI problem, unless we have a sprung pelvis, is typically not going to be a primary issue. So you're not going to be one and done. If you inject SIs and they improve, better be looking for a root cause because that's not probably going to be it. Breaks wide with the hind feet at a long trot. So when our horse moves, unless we are riding a gaited horse, which is a whole nother topic, but when we're talking about our performance quarter horses, when we're long trotting, we want that foot to come and at least land in the footprint, the front footprint. The old timers used to talk about the stride of a horse, where if they land a little bit in front of that footprint, you've got a horse that's really reaching and driving up underneath. Now, sometimes that's a little misconception because that horse may be forging. But if we have a horse that has to break out wide And when we're long trotting them, they almost kind of look like they're impacted. They have a robotic movement because their hind feet look too wide. You will also see that in times at a walk as well. If you're assessing that horse from behind, again, the way that I describe it is they look like they're walking, like they look like they're impacted. They're just wide and almost kind of bloaty looking as they move. That can be a sign that we need to address something in the back and probably the hamstrings as well. Difficulty walking in a straight line down an incline or struggles going uphill. They look like they're running out of steam going up an incline. If you have the horse that has to kind of sidewind down an incline and they cannot just go straight down it, as long as it's a gradual incline. I'm not talking about coming straight down a mountain where we have a lot of force on over the front feet. That would be something that I would probably look to address the stifle and back component. Unable to bring the hind feet up into the steps of the forefeet. We just talked about that. Travels with a locked, stiff neck, especially at a trot. Sometimes it's a high carriage. Sometimes they're ducking under the paint. But if they look really rigid through that neck and robotic in the neck, they are balancing or counterbalancing for an issue in the back or the hind end. Crosses the midline in a circle. I have done countless videos on this. If you want a good visual representation, go to our corrective exercise playlist on the Superior Therapy Facebook page. I also address in there how we use raised poles to start to correct this posture, because body work is one component of it, motion and exercise is another component of it. And now here's a list of issues that could be horse or rider. So you have to take these into context of each individual situation. But feeling like one seat bone touches the back but not the other. So your sit bones are our ischium that we sit on. If you feel like one side makes contact with the back and the other doesn't, that could be a mechanical issue with your horse, where your horse is not traveling balanced, or it could be an issue in your hips. That's something that I have to address pretty commonly with myself. Feeling like one stirrup is longer than the other, even though they're set balanced. Again, got to figure out, do we have an issue in your spine and your hips, or do we have an issue with your horse? The rider feels twisted in the saddle, or if you're wearing a jacket, your jacket tends to pull over to one side by the time you get done riding. Again, in that aspect, we got to figure out, is it your back and hips, or is it your horse's back and hips? Saddle slipping to one side. I have encountered this a lot. Now, when I have that happening, I have seen it happen due to the stifle being a root cause of the issue. I have seen it happen due to the back being the root cause. Again, these things, they're so interconnected. I rarely ever check a back without also checking the stifle. I feel like those two things partner together so frequently that you got to check both. Because if we have an issue in the stifle, it's obviously going to cause back pain. If we have an issue in the back, it changes the functionality of the stifle, which causes stifle issues. The rider having back pain after riding. All right. So again, we got to figure out, is it you or is it the horse? But we better investigate both in those circumstances. Hopefully it's easy for you to establish if it's the horse or you based on some of these other signs that we're going to give that are going to be indicative of an issue just with the horse itself. Here's another one that I encounter a lot with my younger riders. Here will be the parents' complaint. They go, yeah, we just worked and she doesn't sit down in her saddle. Like, she just dumps forward. She's just always dropping her shoulders. She's dumping forward. And this can happen in adults as well. I spent a lot of years thinking my problem and inconsistency with my mare's performance was my riding. I was like, oh, it's my hips. I'm the problem. I'm the problem. Well, then find an OCD in the stifle and unresolved back pain and things that my mare deals with. And I was like, oh, well, maybe we were both the problem actually. So now hopefully we are both fixed and we will be a more balanced team when we get back to competing. But if you feel so when I encounter this circumstance, I'll go and I'll ask the kid, I say, hey, when you go into the turn, does it feel like your horse's loin area or their low back is hitting you in the butt, trying to knock you out of the buggy? Do you feel like you're trying to fall out of the buggy all the time in a turn? And 9 times out of 10, they'll go, yeah, that's exactly what I feel. That is a horse that is forging up underneath themselves. So instead of moving with their glutes and their core correctly in good posture, that horse is probably forging up underneath. So they're just swinging their hind legs up with not much clearance. And what that ends up doing is it brings that lumbar up and it hits you in the rear, and you end up with this feeling like you're being dumped over your saddle horn. And so, when I find that, typically I also find restriction in the low back, restriction in the hamstrings. And so, I feel like it's important to involve what our owners and what our riders feel, but it also backs up whenever I'm working on a horse. I'll ask the rider, like, man, does he feel like he's dumping you forward or he's dumping on the inside shoulder? And they go, oh my gosh, how did you know that? Well, because of the tension in the body. That's what told me. So one other movement one I will add in there as well is a horse that doesn't have a lot of ground clearance, that drags the front toes or that forges up underneath. And sometimes you'll see horses that overreach a lot because of that as well. And so, if I have a good farrier, my feet are in balance, and I have a horse that is pulling shoes frequently, I'm going to look at back and I'm going to look at stifles. All right. So here are some physical signs that your body worker sees. Now, these may be secondary to something else, but I think it's important to address all of the pieces of the puzzle. So these are going to be signs that I see before I ever even put my hands on a horse. This comes into that visual assessment. Uneven muscling on either side of the pole. That means I have a horse that is balancing with their head. When they are overdeveloped on one side, and sometimes you may have overdevelopment on both sides, but you would usually have one that's going to correlate to the weak diagonal that will be more overbuilt. Overbuilding in front of the shoulder blades. When we have overbuilding in front of the shoulder blades, that is a result of a horse that is having to dip out and dump too much weight over the front of their feet. So that means they are standing with a posture that is bringing their front legs back too far underneath them, and locking their knees, so they end up leaning out over their front toes. Overbuilding in the pecs, front and behind the girt area. So when we have overbuilding in the pecs, a lot of times, again, this stuff starts to shorten because the horse has to balance with the front end. So they move that front end farther back to make up for a weaker hind end. This gets back into our posture of correcting our core, correcting that posture that we're going to talk about in the rehab section of this podcast. Overbuilding at the withers. The horse looks like a bulldog. So, not uncommon for people with back pain. What ends up happening? We end up bringing our shoulders up. As a massage therapist, I would say, let me disconnect your shoulders from your earlobes because they don't belong there. With women, it's usually really easy to figure out which side is problematic because I can ask which bra strap is shorter. Now with our horses, obviously we have to look a little closer there because I don't have those obvious questions that I can ask. And, those bulldog horses typically will kind of dip underneath that with that neck. And I call it dipping under the pain. A horse that is going to have atrophy behind the withers typically will have a sharper dip right in front of where our thoracic starts, so right in front of the withers, because as that horse has to elevate in motion, we start to see the withers atrophy behind it, and we start to see that dip come in there. And that would tell me, okay, this is a horse that is elevating, trying to use the front end for motion instead of using their hind end. Loss of hair anywhere under the saddle. If I have crinkled hair, hair that looks discolored, rub marks, it's my job as a therapist to detect these things before it becomes a true pressure sore. If I have, sometimes I will even see rub marks from the saddle pad, which I don't like a really long saddle pad on a horse. But when I have a saddle pad that's an appropriate size and I have rub marks back and forth, typically that is going to be a result of overbuilding in that loin area. So as that horse is in motion, it kind of comes back to that foraging and feeling like that lumbar is going to come up and hit you in the rear. You will see rubbing underneath the saddle pad there, even on a saddle pad that's clean. Long hollow areas in the back muscles or raised at the loin. We just talked about that. We've talked a lot about being elevated and raised there. If I have back muscles that come up and almost hide the spine, like if they are so overbuilt on either side that that's a focal point for me, I know there's going to be tension there. You're also going to find tension in the hamstrings because our low back and our hamstrings partner together. When we have a horse that does not have good core strength and does not have good glute strength, something's got to take over. And so our back and our hamstrings go, well, it's not our job, but we're going to try to hold this horse up anyway. And that usually leads to a lot of tension and restriction in the spine. You can have the spinous process is raised in only like one or two spots. So like when you go to feel down that back, if you hit a bump and then a bump, doesn't necessarily mean that those spots are touching. We would love it if kissing spine was that easy to diagnose, but it's not. Usually what you're feeling there when we're talking about horses with roach back or things like that is that fascial tissue starts to thicken over those areas. And so you have areas of reduced circulation there. I've had really good success with being able to balance those areas out if I catch them early enough. If it's the horse that's 22 years old and really, really roached back, a lot of times you're not going to be able to completely remedy that. But when I have a spot or two that has just started, absolutely we can correct that with rehab therapy and with body work. SIs that are unlevel or different heights. That's, to me, in my experience, that is a result of compensation. Now, we could have the horse that has that due to trauma of they tried to jump something at one point, they have a hip that's knocked down. Trauma will be your exception to a lot of rules when we talk about therapy. And then the last one, unbalanced glutes, overbuild hamstrings, overbuild gaskin muscles, tensor fasciae latae, which is our rope muscle that goes down about the area that you would brand your horse if you have a brand on the hip, overbuilding in the adductors. When we have imbalance from one side to the other, we've got to stop and ask ourselves why. They shouldn't just be that way. Here's another little tip that I don't hear a lot of people talk about, but it has sure saved me throughout my career. When I have a horse that is not underweight, but when I lift that tail, they have a really sunken in rectum, I'm going to know that I have imbalance in the sacrum. I'm going to have a pelvic tilt. I'm also going to have tension in the back. And here's why. So the way that I teach this is I use a human example. So in women, when our pelvic floor is weak, and our pelvic floor connects to our diaphragm, right? So when that pelvic floor is weak and contracted, then everything kind of starts to pull together. And then when you go to laugh or sneeze and you have some leakage, typically that's going to come from a weak contracted pelvic floor because everything's already contracted because it's weak. And so then you go to sneeze and you need to tense everything. Well, it can't tense anymore because it's already tense. So then you have that leakage. So even though we don't see that phenomenon in horses, I use that as the example to teach with on the sunken rectum. So when we have tension moving through our ventral line of fascia, moving through that abdominal area, through that back, it's kind of like smushing an accordion together. And so that rectum just gets pulled forward. So I talk about this all the time in our bodywork course and with owners whenever I'm working on their horses, I usually have my owners come and look as I start to relax the hamstrings, the adductors moving up into that back, that ventral line of fascia. As I start to relax everything, that rectum will start to slowly come back to a more neutral position. So, again, this is not going to be something that you can use for the underweight horse that you just rescued, because we know that that sinking in comes with being undernourished and malnourished. But when I have the horse that otherwise looks healthy and that rectum is sunken in, telltale sign of a back horse. Does not mean you have kissing spine. Telltale sign there's tension in the back, tension in the underline. Carries the tail to one side or clamps down their tail, or a horse that swishes their tail. Now, tail swishing can be a sign of ovaries, can be a sign of ulcers. That can go to a lot of other things as well. But typically, your tail is going to be carried to the side where the back is the most tight, because as that gets shortened, it pulls that tail to the side. Now, you may have a horse that is tied in both sides of the back, and maybe when you circle them one way, it pulls that way. When you circle them the other way, it pulls the other way. We see that a lot in treads. Obviously, our exception here is going to be a breed type where the tail goes to the side. So again, talking about thoroughbreds, quarter horses, our performance horses, whenever we are assessing where they're carrying their tail. And also too, that's part of the reason that I am against nerving tails, clipping tails. My question is that tail tells us a lot about what's going on in the body, because the horse uses it to balance. When I have a horse that flags that tail back behind in a run, that is typically a horse that has some imbalance going on in the pelvis, probably some tension in the back. And I want to address that rather than be like, well, I'll just nerve this tail and I won't have to deal with it. When you nerve a tail, that will snowball into some bigger problems you'll get to address later on, because you don't have that assessment point. And so the root cause of the annoyance of the tail will probably reveal itself and cost you more vet bills down the way. Another telltale sign of a back horse, when I have a gelding or a stallion that drops out when I'm palpating the back or stays dropped out the entire time I'm doing body work, telltale sign of a back horse. Not uncommon as you start to work through points that affect the bladder. They will even dribble urine at times. And that tells me, okay, I'm getting the nerve starting to open back up to the bladder area as well. But whenever they drop out like that, telltale sign of a back horse. Other things on geldings dropping out, if they partially drop out and there is a slight erection in that area, telltale sign of a back horse. I would prefer a horse to drop out and be relaxed, but when they don't drop out completely, telltale sign of a back horse. Locked ribs. Each of our thoracic vertebrae attaches to a rib. And so if we have an issue in the amount of spring that you have in the ribs, it's going to also be reflected in restriction in the back. You can try it on yourself. You can't really see my ribs here, but if I take my hands and I press and spring up and down my ribs, Even in the ribs that are attached to the sacrum that are a little more of a fixed rib, you should still have some spring there because it's not a solid attachment. It's attached by soft tissue connection. So we should be able to have some movement. That's what allows us to expand and breathe. So if our horse has locked ribs, you're gonna have some blockage up in the thoracic as well. So now we're gonna get into behavior. And some of these you have to know your horse, but I find so many times that owners are like, oh, he just does that, oh, he just acts that way, oh, he's that's just him. And it's not. So as a therapist, it is my job to advocate for the horse. I'm not claiming that I know your horse better than you do, but I've had an extensive study in behavior patterns and how they are reflected in the horse. And, I will go to bat for that horse, even if it means having a strong disagreement in a respectful manner with an owner or with a vet, because it's my job to advocate, and it's my job as a therapist to study everything I can study about the behavior of the horse. One, so that I can keep myself safe while I'm working on your ulcery horse that's trying to bite my face off. Two, so that I can choose the best plan of action for that horse, because maybe the best plan of action is loosening areas in other areas before I go to that problem area. Okay, so behavior, stoic versus reactive. We touched on that pretty much in detail there. Setting back when they have not been spooked by something. I'm going to clarify a little bit. We all know if the rogue Walmart bag flies under our horse's feet, what you get's what you get. That does not necessarily mean we have a physical problem in the body. That's a flight response of a flight animal. We would like to have enough training that maybe that horse learns to spook in place, but that ain't always what you get. But what I'm talking about with setting back is going back to my comparison between the horse's spine and our spine that I started this podcast with. If something spooks that horse, they should flee whenever their glutes engage, core engages. We're going to get the heck out of Dodge. That horse should want to move forward. Even if it's I jump forward, but I don't have anywhere to go, so I'm going to roll back and spin around and run the other way. That is still counted as a forward movement. But when we have the horse that I spook them from behind and they still reel backwards, that is a sign of psoas dysfunction, and that is a sign of a connectivity issue going up the spine to the brain. Because a horse, by nature, by design, should flee away forward, because that is how they are designed. In the same way that if you scare me, I'm going to spring upward, think the Scooby-Doo cartoon, before I take off running forward. So when we have a horse that reels backwards, a lot of times you're going to find tension in the psoas. You may find some negative plantar angles in the feet behind, or a horse that's low-heeled. They are not able to engage and have that surging movement, so they have rewired their flight system in their brain to go, everything that scares me, I'm going to sit back. Everything that scares me, I'm going to run backwards, run backwards, run backwards. I'm not strong enough to go forwards. I must go backwards. And so we have to break that flight response as we're starting to work on them in therapy. And we would find horses that would want to run backwards and not get on the tread. As soon as you start to correct some of the imbalance and issues in the body, they have more of a willingness to go forward. They have more of a willingness to stand tied. And part of that is reconnecting those neural pathways to the brain. When we start to reconnect those, we can lower that flight response. The horse is not stuck in flight. That psoas is not staying engaged and on all the time. And it takes away the likeliness of that explosive behavior without reason. Again, that rogue Walmart bag will get the most of them. somebody jumping out, spooking them. In certain breeds are going to have a higher flight response than others. Certain bloodlines have a higher flight response than others. But we need the horse that can come down out of flight and go into relaxation. When we talk about what our psoas does in the body, our psoas is our survival muscle. And to be honest, it's important enough. It probably deserves its own podcast, because I have had extensive research in this with myself, as well as working with horses. At one point they tried to go in and surgically lengthen my psoas. Would not recommend that surgery, would not do that one again, would not recommend that one to anyone, because it didn't do anything other than cause my pelvis to shift and cause the other side to tighten even more trying to balance. Did not yield me any results. I've done psoas injections, I've done Botox in the psoas, you name it. I have had a long battle with correcting problems in the psoas, and a lot of it came down to recorrecting my flight response, helping nourish the adrenals versus draining them. And again, it's going to be its own podcast topic. But what I'm going to touch on in this podcast is when we have the horse that is stuck in flight, the back can never relax. Our psoas is that survival muscle of, oh, there's a bear coming over here. I'm going to spring into a flight response and I'm going to run to safety. But when I get to safety, I want to come down and relax. So a human example that I like to teach with is, it's like when you're walking down a dark alley that really isn't safe, and it's like, wow, we probably shouldn't be walking down this, but here we are. That little clutch or grab feeling that you feel in your stomach is your psoas engaging, saying, we have got to be on high alert. We should not be here. But when you get home and, you're telling your husband, yeah, I went down this dark alley and this was dumb, but here I am, I made it. Your body should come down from that experience and you take a deep breath, because it's like, oh, I'm home, I'm safe. I'm going to tell my husband about this funny experience, get a lecture about it, and then I'm going to go on like this never happened and probably just not go down that alley again. Where the dysfunction comes in is when that horse cannot, or human, doesn't have that discharge of that energy, when that psoas doesn't go back into a rest and digest mode of when we just stay on. So then it becomes your husband closes a pantry door in the kitchen and that makes you jump because your psoas is still engaged. And so we see that with horses too. Like the horse that you shut a stall door too quickly and they panic. That is going to be a horse that is going to have back tension. Sensitivity to grooming, horses that are cold backed, a horse that drops out from underneath that rider when you go to get on, bucking, that's an obvious behavior. Those are all going to be things that we connect to the back. Shies away from blankets or saddles. When I have a horse that, is obviously a trained horse, it's not a colt that we're saddling for the first time, and you go to throw the saddle pad on and they shy away from you, that would be a instance where we would go, how tight is the back? How tight are the hamstrings? How tight are these connected attachments that lead into back issues? And I touched a little bit about this earlier in the podcast, of a horse that backs up on stuff, rubs their tail head, but they don't need deworming, sits like a dog after rolling and scoots back and forth. Like a lot of times that's a horse that's trying to create better alignment in the pelvis. A horse that sits on feeders, the corner of a stall, the trailer doors. I find this even with mares that have really hard cycles and they are sitting on stuff because of a cycle issue. I tend to find that comes from issues in the back. I would find this with people as well. Cysts on ovaries, irregular cycles, hard cycles. A lot of times, if you can come in there and loosen that back up and you can remedy issues in the back, the body will correct itself and that cycle will return to normal. The same thing can be said with constipation and diarrhea. Sometimes I have the person that comes in that they go, everything I eat runs through me. Doesn't matter how clean of a diet I eat, it's all going to run through me. We start to go in there and eliminate restriction in the back. It allows better connectivity of the nerves, and that those nerve pathways slows the digestion down. On the flip side of that, also not uncommon for me to work on a person or a horse that has had trouble, that there's like, I don't know what to do, I'm eating everything right and I'm not regular. You go in there and loosen that back up, chances are they're going to get up off that table before the session is even ended. And with my horses, it's not uncommon for me to have a 5 or 6 poop circle around where I'm working on a horse that has had very stagnant digestion. And, areas that we look at for those nerve pathways, when we have a horse that's impacted, a lot of times we are looking at that T18 connection. When we have a horse that is the nervous pooper, or they get really tight and sore in the back, and then they just get soft poo, soft manure, a lot of times you're going to look around that L3 connection there. Not to say that we don't address the entire spine, because it's never just one thing, right? But when we're talking about where those nerves come out, that's what we're looking at. Also, that connection between L3 and the stifles. When we have blockage in that L3 area, our nerve that goes to patella, the stifle, also comes right through that area as well. And so, jumping back into our behavior things, horses that get cast frequently in stalls and on fences, a lot of times I see that correlate to tension in the back. It has to do with that proprioception, not paying attention to where I'm laying down, and making a mistake of getting too close. When they frequently get cast, I want to look and see how much tension there is in the back. Maybe our sciatic nerve is having an issue, and they feel like if they lay down close enough to that wall, they can catch themselves that they're going to fall. Bad trailer behavior. That's another thing I want to touch on. As therapists, we are always looking at your horse when they come off the trailer. Do they have a sweat mark or a rub mark where they have rode one side of the divider the whole trip? Are they a horse that has to balance and they pull the mats down because they're tearing them down with their heels? That would be something that would make me go, oh, I need to look at stifles and back. And when we have bad trailer behavior, a lot of times it's because that tension in the back is taking away the ability for the stifles to absorb concussion. Or maybe we have a pain in the stifles that is causing that back to have to tense up and try to reduce concussion, but what it ends up doing is increasing the tension. A lot of times those horses won't stand on the vibration plates either, like TheraPlates and stuff like that. It's hard to get them to stand on there if they don't have a good ability to absorb concussion through the stifles, and if they're rigid in the back, they're just like, yeah, no, this is more tension and less relaxation, and I just don't want to stand on it. Or you have to turn it down to where you are increasing circulation in the lower leg, but the vibration doesn't travel up high to where the areas of restriction are. Other observed indicators that I'll talk about a little bit is poor hoof growth. Thin soles, poor hoof growth equals poor blood supply. At the very simple root of it, why are we not getting enough blood flow down the hoof? Is it because we are stuck in a compensatory pattern that is reducing the blood flow going down the leg? Is it because we have poor angles that is putting excess pressure on the nerves, like the sciatic or the femoral nerve? And, we're not getting good feedback. And so, when our nerves don't give good feedback, then our circulatory system slows down. again, our organs slow down, our fascia starts to tighten up and go into a protective mode. It is not uncommon to see hoof growth accelerate as we release tension in the body. Camped out, camped under stance, we talked about that. Some people describe it as a goat on a rock, where, all of our little feet are trying to stand together like if we were standing on a narrow rock. Another visual is an elephant standing on a circus ball. That's a horse that is camped under. A horse that's camped out in the hind end would be a horse that wants to stand like a Morgan, but is not a Morgan. If we are elongating that back and pushing that pelvis in and keeping those legs way back out behind, that's typically going to mean that we've got to have a higher headset, and we're inverting that back, which reduces the body's ability to send circulation down the hind legs. On those horses, typically you will see hamstrings that are stretched out. They have an appearance where it looks like a rubber band that has just been overstretched that won't snap back to its original shape. Sometimes the overbuilding, you can have some overbuilding where the hamstrings are a focal point in either one. Really your hamstrings should melt into the rest of the hip and blend. They should not be over exaggerated, overbuilt, or a focal point when you stand behind the horse and look. Toes out on the hind feet. We've talked a lot about hoof angles. We're going to get into more of this when we talk about talking to your vet, but I am a huge advocate for x-raying hind feet. I mean, really x-raying all 4 feet, but definitely x-raying the hind feet when we're talking about back issues. Reoccurring stifle issues, reoccurring EPM, bad cycles in mares, bleeding in performance. This comes back to the restriction. Everybody is so avid of everything needs to be on Lasix. My thing, I'm never going to tell somebody take your horse off of Lasix. That's not within my scope of practice. But here is something to think about. When we have tight back tension, and going back to my deflated horse, that horse that we poked him and let the air out, and our fascial system is so restricted, you're not able to take a deep breath. So let's talk a little bit about core function. Because what I find is people cannot tell the difference, the average horse owner cannot tell the difference in a tight, restricted, contracted abdominal area and a horse that is fit. When we talk about fitness, even the most athletic fit person, when they are sitting on their couch, should be able to relax and almost have a little bit of a skin roll there. Those of us who have a little more around the midsection, we're going to have a little bit more of a skin roll, even if we have good muscle function. But I think it gets misconstrued because of like what we see in movies. It's like you're not going to have the Chris Hemsworth looking guy with abs you could wash your clothes on sitting on his couch in an off season. Before they shoot those shirtless scenes in the movies, they have that person get their core fired up and engaged. Whether it be that they do an exercise routine, whether it be that they do something to surge some adrenaline through the body, they are also dehydrating the body and eliminating the water to get those big over-the-top effects. Hugh Jackman actually just did a great interview on the dehydration process of pulling the water off of his body so that he could do the ab scenes in the new Deadpool movie. So that is an achievable result for a short amount of time, but you don't want to live in that thought process of this is what you should look like. So coming back to your horse, I have this little demonstration that I do that you can find where I explain the difference in tight and contracted versus the overweight horse. And the overweight horse actually has better utilization of the air coming through their body. than the tight contracted horse, because when that restriction contracts, you cannot intake the air like you need to. So, when we go back, circling back to like our bleeding and performance, what happens in the body when we have something that's already tight and contracted and restricted in fascia, and then we suck the water off of them? We create more restriction, and we create a body that has a harder time recovering afterwards. So, again, this is not a pro or con on Lasix. That's a topic I don't really like to touch on, because the opinions, people wield their opinions like a weapon, and their only intent is to cut others down with their opinion, and they don't look at it from a whole horse perspective. But, that I'm going to leave you with that little thought to ponder there, of when we have that tight abdominal area and then we remove the water, well, our body needs fluid to have correct muscle functionality. So TMJ issues. So I'm going to move on to TMJ issues. There are two ways of linking the connection between TMJ issues and stifles. I tend to find, unless there's trauma, this horse has been kicked in the face, hit their face, has dental issues, those are my exceptions. But when we don't have any of those things present, but we have a TMJ issue, I have 95%, maybe more of the time, found a connection to it in the hind end, coming from the hind end forward. So if you want an Eastern medicine stance on the connection between the stifle and the TMJ, Eastern medicine says the stifle connects to the TMJ flowing through the stomach meridian. If you want a Western medicine thought process on it, the ventral line of fascia connects the TMJ to the stifle through the pecs, the abdominals, and then ends in the extensor tendon of the hind leg. So when we have, going back to that contracted abdomen, when our abdomen is contracted, because we also have back pain or tension present, we are going to see that reflected in the TMJ. I tend to find TMJ issues on the same side as the weaker diagonal. I tend to find more pole issues on the opposite side. So you can note that. That's just my experience as a body worker, and that little bit of information has held true for me. And so another, like, kind of one thing that I want to close with before we come back and talk about, okay, now we've talked about all the things that are wrong with our horse. How do we go about fixing it? We're going to come back with that in another podcast. So I want to talk a little bit about the timid rider. And I'm not calling anyone out. I am describing a type. Maybe this type is you. Maybe this type is someone you know. So in this day and time, people are so focused on competition. They come and they want to buy that finished barrel horse that, frankly, maybe they're a little bit overmounted. That's okay. If that's your heart horse, you can learn to ride him. I promise you. That's why our great horsemen are always seeking to expand their skills and improve themselves as a rider. So no judgment for the horse that you choose to ride. But I want to paint a scenario for you, and I want you to think about this. So we have the rider that's a little overmounted. So usually you're going to have a bigger shanked bit on, because you need to feel safe. You need to feel that illusion of control of the situation. And so we have a shanked bit, a person that's riding a little higher handed, because they're trying to keep that horse up in their hand because they feel like that gives them a better sense of control. Usually one-handed coming into the first barrel, death grip on the saddle horn, with the other hand in a very deep-seated saddle that's setting you far back on the, closer to the lumbar area of the horse. So we are causing this horse to start to elevate in motion because we are behind the balance point as a rider. And, I've seen some people look like they're riding a saddle bronc horse coming in to the arena. And, part of that is a fear aspect, but we're locking that TMJ, as we are engaging and hanging on that horse's mouth, we are keeping that TMJ from moving like it needs to, keeping that jaw locked, which also then in case locks our stifle. So we end up having a horse that is climby coming in. They get back behind the barrel and we snatch them. So then they just pivot around on the hindquarters and there's no balance to it. So we have this horse that has a very upright, climby running style. So we know if they are upright and climbing in the front, that back is also inverted. So our hamstrings are trying to stabilize the back instead of being able to do their job. We've eliminated our use of the core. Like you cannot have good core function and be running that inverted. So then that person gets on Facebook and they go, well, my horse isn't snappy in the turns and he just is discombobulated and he's not balanced, or maybe he's fallen because he can't handle the ground because his head is too high. So then social media's answer to that is, oh, put a head setter on it. Put a head setter or a tie down because he needs a balance point. So now we've still got our shanked bit. We're causing that elevation and we run in there. And then when we ask that horse to engage and turn, they hit that head setter and it's like pulling an e-brake where it slams that hind end in the ground because you've locked your stifle. And we have this like screeching halt of a turn. And that over time will cause a terrible amount of stifle issues and back pain. It'll also cause that horse to start to break into a compensation pattern that causes the horse to become NPA or low heeled. And so, as a industry, we need to start to recognize when we are creating things that are outside of that horse's posture. We are trapping them in. So this circles all the way back around to when the back is not rounded, the hind leg cannot swing up underneath and engage, and we end up with a horse that is not in good function. And when we have back problems starting, whether there's pain or not, we're going to end up having kidney, liver issues with our organs, all kinds of sorts of problems. And then, of course, at the end of all of these snowball of problems, we start to create change in the back. Kissing spine does not happen overnight. Kissing spine is preventable. You don't always have to jump to surgery. In my opinion, sometimes surgery is necessary, but it's looking deeper than what the radiographs show. Where did we lose the strength in our suspension bridge that is the horse's spine? Why would we wait until the bridge collapses to do something about it? And a great kind of a morbid example here, but it's a valid example. Let's think about the suspension bridge accidents that we have seen on the news. What happens when the core, what happens when the bottom, the strengthening part of our bridge gets hit by a barge or collapses? The whole suspension bridge collapses. The same can be said for the core strength in our horses. When we don't keep that core strong and functioning correctly, then our spine is going to start to invert and shorten, and our top poles of our suspension bridge get pulled together. And when that happens over an extended amount of time, those vertebrae start to get too close together and kiss. And as we have that kissing spine develop, what the real concern is the disruption in the nerve function that the body needs, not only to survive, but to thrive in a competitive environment and in a competitive industry. At the end of the day, we are advocates for the well-being of the horse. And so hopefully If you've learned nothing in this podcast, maybe I have opened and expanded your thought process to include some factors that aren't just related to pain. Because if we can start to identify these problematic scenarios that can be remedied very quickly because they're in an acute state and they haven't been there long enough to cause bony changes in the body, if we can create a better balanced horse, we can prevent a lot of these problems. And so, if nothing else, I hope that I've opened your thought process to observing behaviors, observing superficial things, working with therapists in collaboration with your vet, working with your farrier for better hoof angles. Because so many days on social media, I feel like a broken record because I'm saying the same thing to 20 different people because it's not taught enough. We always want a training aid to fix this. We want to put a needle in it and we want it fixed tomorrow. We want to do all of these things except for make the decisions for a better quality of life through corrections in posture. So join us back on the next podcast where we're going to talk about how do we fix this.